Okay, so let's be real for a second. Has you ever tried to learn about agile project management?
Yeah.
It can feel kind of like someone just dumped a giant jigsaw puzzle in your lap,
Oh, definitely.
and they forgot to give you the picture on the box. There are all these frameworks and methodologies, and oh, don't forget the manifestos.
There's a lot to process.
It really is. So that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're going to explore this guide, the Agile Practice Guide.
Yeah.
And it was created by two big organizations, the Project Management Institute and the Agile Alliance.
Okay.
And what's great is this guide, it's like having an agile expert right there with you, ready to answer all your questions.
Right.
And clear up all the confusion because there's a lot of it out there.
What I think is really cool about it, about the guide, is that it doesn't pretend Agile is like this one-size-fits-all,
Right.
It actually says, hey, sometimes Agile is not the right way to go.
Yeah, totally.
Sometimes you need something more traditional, like what they call predictive.
Right, we're going to get into that. We're going to compare the two, agile versus predictive.
Yeah.
And you might be surprised to hear that they can actually, work together.
That's interesting, yeah.
And speaking of surprises, get this. One of the core agile methods, it's called Kanban. You may have heard of it. It was inspired by grocery stores.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know. But more on that a little bit later. For today, our goal is to give you, the listener, like a solid understanding of what agile really means, when it makes sense to use it, and how it's different from those traditional project management methods.
Yeah, and I think that's super important because, like you were saying, it's not a magic solution. You can't just use Agile everywhere.
No, definitely not. If you just force it on a project where it's not a good fit, it can actually backfire.
Oh, yeah. It's going to create way more problems than it solves.
Exactly. So let's just dive right in, shall we? Let's tackle this whole agile versus predictive thing. Is it a cage match or?
Right.
So the guide actually uses this visual. It's called the Stacy complexity model. And what it does is it shows how do you choose the right approach to a project?
Uh-huh.
And it really depends on how much uncertainty there is.
Yeah.
How much disagreement about what you're actually trying to build.
I see. So if you're building a house, you have blueprints,
Exactly.
you have a budget,
Yeah.
and you probably have a pretty good idea of what that house is going to look like in the end.
Right.
So that's low uncertainty. And that kind of project, that's where a predictive approach works really well, because you're focusing on all that planning up front.
Okay.
But then you have developing a brand new app where everything's changing all the time. Customers are like, we want this, we want that. And the technology is evolving.
So much uncertainty.
Right. That's high uncertainty. And that's actually where Agile shines, because it's all about being able to change and adapt quickly.
Right. And it sounds like from what you're saying, it's not about I have to be 100% agile or I have to be 100% predictive. It's really more about figuring out what's the right approach for this specific project.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know what? The guide even talks about what they call hybrid approaches,
Oh,
where you're actually combining both agile and predictive elements.
Okay, I'd love to hear an example of that.
Yeah. So imagine you're building this complex software system, and for the development part, you're using an agile mindset, But when it's time to deploy that system to thousands of users, maybe you want to use a more structured, predictive approach just to make sure that rollout goes smoothly.
That makes a lot of sense. It's you can tailor it to what you need at that moment.
Exactly.
But I think it's time to dig into the heart of agile, the mindset,
Yeah.
because it's about so much more than just stand-up meetings and sticky notes.
Oh, absolutely. It's a whole different way of thinking about work,
Yeah.
How you collaborate and how you actually deliver value.
And to understand that shift, I think we have to talk about this thing called the Agile Manifesto. It's a really short but powerful document, and it lays out these 4 core values of Agile. So maybe you can help us unpack those a little bit.
Sure. So the first one is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And what that means is they're really emphasizing that people are at the heart of every project.
Okay.
And it's about open communication, collaboration, really valuing those individual interactions.
So it's flipping the script on that traditional hierarchy, where decisions take forever because they have to go through all these layers.
Exactly. It's about being more collaborative and human-centered.
I like that. Human-centered project management. Okay, what's the second value?
The second one is working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, that doesn't mean documentation isn't important.
Okay.
But what they're saying is the real measure of progress is, do you have a product that actually works?
Yeah.
Not just a bunch of, documents and paperwork.
Oh, I've been there. everything on paper says 90% complete, but when you actually go to use it, nothing works.
Exactly. So it's about focusing on tangible results.
Makes sense. What's the third value?
Okay, the third one is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And what this means is you're not just like signing a contract and then disappearing, you know?
Right.
You're actually building a partnership with your clients. You're working together to figure out what's the best solution.
I like that because it sounds like it allows for more flexibility, especially in those situations where, maybe the client's needs change or the scope of the project is a little fuzzy.
Exactly. Agile recognizes that, things change and you need to be able to adapt. And that leads us to the fourth value, which is responding to change over following a plan.
That seems almost like counterintuitive to traditional project management, where it's all about sticking to the plan no matter what.
Yeah, but Agile says, hey, change is going to happen. You can't avoid it. So you need to be ready to respond to those changes, not just rigidly stick to a plan that might not be relevant anymore.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, these four values are pretty simple, but they seem really powerful.
Yeah,
And they definitely challenge a lot of those traditional ideas about work and projects.
definitely.
But the guide also mentions these 12 principles that go a bit deeper into the Agile mindset. I'm curious, are these principles just like theoretical concepts, or do they actually, impact how projects are done in the real world?
Oh, they definitely have a real world impact. Like one of the principles is simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential.
Okay.
That's interesting, right? Because a lot of times we think more is better.
More features, more deliverables, more.
Right. But Agile says, hold on a second. What's the simplest way to get this done and actually deliver value?
So it's about being really intentional and focusing on what matters, not just doing busy work. Okay, so that's one principle. What's another one that stands out to you?
Another one is about continuous improvement. It says, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly.
So it's not just about getting the project done, but also about the team, constantly learning and growing and getting better.
Right, it's built into the process.
Okay, I like that. But I think it's time to move beyond the theory and talk about, how does this actually work in practice, right? Like, how are Agile teams structured? And what are some of the things they do that are different from, traditional project teams?
So one of the big differences with Agile teams is this focus on cross-functional teams.
Okay.
So instead of having all these separate departments, like working in silos, Agile teams bring together people with all sorts of different skills.
Okay, so you've got your designers, your developers, testers, business analysts, everybody together.
Exactly, all working together towards the same goal.
So it's kind of like, instead of having to run back and forth to different pantries to get all the ingredients for a cake, you just have everything you need right there in one room.
That's a great way to put it. And what this does is it makes decision-making so much faster.
Right.
There's less miscommunication, and ultimately you can deliver value more quickly.
That makes sense. So the guy also talks about the importance of T-shaped individuals.
Yes.
Now, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. What exactly does it mean to be T-shaped?
Okay, so picture the letter T, right?
Uh-huh.
The vertical line, that represents deep expertise in one specific area.
So, maybe they're a fantastic software developer.
Exactly, or
Yeah.
a brilliant designer. But then the horizontal line of the T, that represents a broader understanding of all the other disciplines that are involved in the project.
Okay, so they're not just a specialist in their own little world.
Right.
They can actually contribute to other areas, too.
Exactly. So that developer, they might have amazing coding skills, but they also have a good grasp of, say, user experience design or even business analysis.
Wow, so they're like a Swiss Army knife of skills. That seems incredibly valuable for an Agile team.
Oh, absolutely. Because T-shaped people, they're adaptable, they're collaborative, and they can really help bridge those gaps between different disciplines, which is so important in Agile, where everything is so fast-paced and iterative.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the team structure, the kind of people you need on an Agile team. But let's talk about some of the specific practices, the things Agile teams actually do.
Sure.
And one that I always hear about is the daily stand-up meeting.
Ah, yeah.
Now, I have to say, I've heard mixed things about stand-ups. Some people love them, and other people are like, ugh, just another meeting I have to go to.
Yeah.
What's the Agile take on daily stand-ups?
So the key to a good Agile stand-up is to keep it short, focused, and action-oriented.
Okay.
It's not about, solving all the problems right then and there. Or giving these long status reports, where everybody drones on and on.
Nobody wants that.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So imagine this. The team gathers for like 15 minutes every morning, and they actually stand up, which helps keep things moving.
Okay.
Each person just quickly shares what they did yesterday, what they're planning to do today, and if there are any roadblocks they need help with.
So it's really just about keeping everyone on the same page.
Right, and making sure that any issues, any potential problems, they're identified early on.
Yeah, that makes sense. If something comes up that needs more discussion, you can always, schedule a separate meeting for that.
Exactly. So another important Agile practice is backlog refinement.
Now, you mentioned the backlog earlier, but can you remind us, what exactly is that?
Yeah, so think of the backlog as like a to-do list for the project.
Okay.
It has all the features, the enhancements, all the tasks that need to be done. But unlike a regular to-do list, the backlog is constantly changing.
Because, as the team learns more about the project, as the customer's needs evolve, you have to be able to adjust.
Right. It's a living document. And that's where backlog refinement comes in.
Okay.
It's a process where the team regularly reviews all those items in the backlog. They discuss them, they make sure they're still relevant, and they reprioritize things as needed.
So it's really about keeping the project aligned with the overall goals and making sure the team is always working on the most important things.
Exactly. And another practice that's really central to Agile is frequent demonstrations or reviews.
And I'm guessing this ties back to that principle we talked about earlier. Working software is the primary measure of progress.
You got it. So instead of waiting until the very end of the project to show the client what you've built, Agile teams actually demonstrate working pieces of the product, at regular intervals throughout the project.
Okay, so it's all about transparency, keeping the customer involved, and getting feedback early and often.
Exactly. That way, you can make sure the project is meeting the customer's expectations, and if you need to make any adjustments, you can do it early on.
Right, before it's too late to change course.
Yeah.
But, Agile isn't just about individual teams doing their own thing, right? It's
Mhm.
about the whole organization embracing these ideas.
You're absolutely right. The guide is really clear about that. For Agile to truly succeed, the entire organization needs to adapt, its structure, its processes, its culture.
Like you can't just sprinkle Agile on top of a traditional organization and expect it to magically transform.
Exactly. It has to be a more fundamental shift.
So what are some of the key things organizations need to think about if they want to, scale up Agile and make it work across the whole company?
Well, one crucial aspect is change management.
Okay.
Organizations need to be ready for the fact that Agile teams can deliver things much faster.
Right.
So those old processes that worked fine in a traditional waterfall environment, they might not cut it anymore.
You might have to streamline things, maybe even rethink some of those processes entirely.
Exactly. And the other really important piece is organizational culture.
Because if you have a culture that's all about control, hierarchy,
Yeah.
sticking to the plan no matter what, that's not going to work well with Agile.
Not at all.
Mhm.
The guide emphasizes that for Agile to thrive, you need a culture of trust, transparency, and continuous learning.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what about contracts? A lot of traditional contracts, they're fixed price, right?
Right.
And the scope is all defined up front.
Yeah.
But with Agile, the scope can change as you go.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile those two things?
That's a great question. And the guide actually suggests looking at different types of contracts that are more aligned with Agile principles.
Okay, so what would that look like?
Well, for example, you could have fixed price contracts for smaller, very well-defined pieces of work. Or you could even have contracts that give the customer the option to cancel early if they're not happy with how things are going.
So it's about creating contracts that encourage collaboration and shared risk.
Exactly. Instead of just rigidly sticking to a predetermined scope.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What happens when you have, larger projects where you have multiple Agile teams working together? How do you keep everyone coordinated and aligned without creating a whole bunch of unnecessary bureaucracy?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge when you're scaling Agile. And the guide does touch on that. They mention frameworks like SAFe, which stands for Scaled Agile Framework,
Okay.
and LessS, which is Large Scale Scrum.
So these frameworks, they're basically like blueprints for how to apply Agile principles to bigger, more complex projects.
Right. But it's important to remember they're not like one-size-fits-all solutions.
You have to adapt them to your specific needs.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between, having some structure and processes in place, but also preserving that agile flexibility and empowerment.
Right. One thing that really stood out to me in the guide is this idea of organizational agility, which goes beyond just using agile methodologies for specific projects.
Yes, that's really important.
So what does that actually mean, organizational agility?
Well, it means creating a culture and a structure in the organization that, embraces change and encourages people to experiment and empowers those teams to respond quickly when things shift, like if there's new information or the market changes.
So it's not just about using like Scrum or Kanban for a software project.
Right.
It's about actually adopting that agile mindset, like for the whole organization.
Exactly. It's about having a culture where everyone is constantly learning, adapting, and, focused on delivering value, no matter what part of the business they're in.
It's been really interesting doing this deep dive because it really highlights how agile is like more than just a methodology. It's almost like a philosophy,
It is.
a different way of thinking about how we work and how we create value.
And what I like about this guide, the Agile Practice Guide, is that it doesn't try to say there's only one right way to do Agile.
Right.
It's like there's no dogma here. It's more about, hey, figure out what works best for you.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because every organization is different, right?
Every project is different.
Every situation is different. So it's really about taking those core principles,
Yeah.
the collaboration, the adaptability, the customer focus, and figuring out how do we actually apply those in a way that makes sense for us.
Exactly. And the guide also says something really interesting. It says, the goal isn't to be agile for its own sake.
Okay.
The goal is to deliver a continuous flow of value.
So it's not about like checking boxes and saying, yep, we're doing agile. It's about actually getting results.
Exactly. It's about constantly evaluating, okay, what's working, what's not working, and how can we adjust?
And that brings up a really interesting question that the guide asks. And I want to, leave our listeners with this to think about. They say, how might this focus on delivering value change the way you think about the projects you're working on, even if you're not using a specific agile methodology?
That is a good question.
Right. Because it makes you think beyond just like the labels and the frameworks and really get down to like, what are those underlying principles that drive successful projects?
Yeah, and I think those principles, they can apply to so many different things, not just software development.
Right. I mean, think about like a marketing campaign or developing a new product or even like organizing a community event.
Yeah.
Those principles of collaboration, adaptability, customer focus, they're still relevant.
Absolutely. It's about being able to respond to those changes, embrace feedback, and work together to achieve something great.
And at the end of the day, it's about creating value, making things better for the people we serve.
That's what it's all about.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. This deep dive into the Agile Practice Guide has given us, and hopefully you, the listener, a lot to think about. And, maybe even a little more clarity about what this whole Agile thing is really all about.
And remember, Agile is a journey. It's not like you arrive at the destination and you're done. It's
Yeah.
about constantly learning, experimenting, and finding what works for you.
So as you continue on your Agile journey, we'd love to hear from you. Share your stories, your insights, even your struggles. What surprised you about Agile? What challenges are you facing? What successes have you had? Join the conversation online using #TheDeepDive, and let's all learn from each other.
Until next time, happy diving!